Hello, welcome. This is episode 130 of My First Job. How do organizations grow? It seems like a simple question, but the answers are complex. Startups aren't like small companies. Small companies aren't like medium sized companies, and so on. The only common factor humans and systems. Creating the systems for every company requires an understanding of markets, human nature, and the ability to adapt. Our guest today, R. Shantaram, has helped companies across several industries manage this. With over 3 decades of experience in all facets of the human resources function at the unit and corporate levels in India and in the USA. He has over 20 years of HR consulting experience with startups, SMEs, established large organizations across a variety of industries: IT, ITES, BPO, power, healthcare, cinema, manufacturing, automobile, and retail. So I'll be talking to him about what it means to develop an organization. My name is Venugopal. I head Ideascape, which is into branding, creative, and design. And we've been doing this for the last couple of years now. So it's my pleasure to welcome Shantaram to the show. Hi, Shantaram. Thank you for
Absolutely
coming on the show.
delighted to be here, Venu. Thank you so much for having me over. Looking forward to a very interesting hour.
So am I. So am I. There are things
Let's see.
I would like to deviate a little from, but then you know where I want to start? You did your B.Sc in statistics. How come? What was what? Don't tell me you were interested in statistics at that age. You were?
No, not really. I think the B.Sc statistics was one of those moments when I felt, really I had to go out and show folks something because you know how it is and how it was in the 80s in Tamil Nadu, right? Um,
Okay.
Everybody expects you to get a centum in maths. And my score was just over 67%, right? It
Okay.
was the lowest score of all subjects in my 12th standard. And I didn't like being mocked. So I said, okay, I'm going to go do maths. So I went to Loyola, asked the principal for a statistics seat. He asked me the reason. And when I told him I wanted to do maths, he offered me maths. But my rationale was the students of maths had to do a minor in physics or chemistry, whereas the students of stats had to do a minor in maths, right? So whatever. Luckily, managed to. I mean, the subject was very interesting. I managed to
Okay.
be among the top
Okay.
three in class right throughout, so wasn't a bad decision. Yeah, and I can do
Yeah.
math. Yes.
Yeah. No, and let's face it, math is there in practically every aspect of life. You can't, you
Absolutely.
think you've escaped it in school and college, but it comes back to bite you at some point or the other. But
Absolutely.
from there to XLRI. So, what is because XLRI is not an easy institution to get into, right?
Well, I would like to believe it was tougher in those days. It seems a lot easier these days. But yeah, it was not easy. I don't know. I guess the stars just aligned. It just happened to
Okay.
get.
Okay.
I don't have any secret formula or 4 steps to crack the SAT or whatever. So,
Unfortunately, that is not an area. You have to try and see what works. There is no, you can't
no, I guess it's
find
again
this
going
lamp
back
and
to
rub
the
it.
yeah. No, I'm
Yeah.
saying it's going back to the basics, right? Which
Yeah.
I think has remained unchanged over the years. How well do you know the basic fundamentals? How good are you at reasoning, logic, ability to work with numbers, ability to work with languages? I think that's in a
Yeah.
sense all it takes.
And then how did HR happen? Was that your first port of call? Was that where you got placed?
Not really. I mean, if you, I guess you would know that Excel has two streams traditionally, one for business management and one for HR, right?
Okay.
And while HR was not my first option, that's what Excel found me fit for, and they offered
Okay.
me a place in that program. Happy to take it, right?
Right.
And I think we had a great time because you are. People talk about HR being close to the business and needing to be talking the language of business and all that. But I guess people like me and people who go to Excel have that advantage, or even the IAMs for that matter, have the advantage that everybody around them is talking business, right?
Okay.
So I guess
Okay.
that was fairly easy moving into the world of corporate India, if I may say so.
Okay. So your first job was from campus recruitment, or you went through a? What was your first
Luckily,
interview like? Do you remember that?
uh, yes, although I mean, if you're talking about first interviews, it was a little before I went to Excel because we had picked
Okay.
up had to try to do some summer jobs and stuff like that. So those
Okay.
interviews were around stats and what we do with stats and things like that because I'd worked for a market research agency over the summers.
Okay.
So that was very, very technical. Right? But beyond that, I
Okay.
mean, in Excel, I wanted to come back to Madras as it was then known. So I did not give too many interviews. It was just the biggies, the Unilever and ITC kind
Okay.
of day one companies. Uh,
Right.
and and then I chose a very homegrown, so to say, firm which had come to campus that year.
Right.
It
Right.
was Tractors and Farm Equipment.
Right. Right.
So yeah.
So, uh, Enfield, right? You started
So I
with
started
Enfield.
my career with TAFE, Tractors and Farm Equipment.
Cafe. Okay. 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 And what were the early days in the job like? What kind of things happened? What was your learning at that point?
So, we're talking about the early 90s, right? And
Right.
HR as a field was itself pretty much in its toddlership, right? It's not, I mean, uh, Professor Uday Parikh, Professor T.V. Rao, they had kind of differentiated HR from the regular personnel kind of work that was going on.
Oh
And
yeah,
therefore,
it used to be
was,
called the personnel department, right?
that's right. So
Yeah.
they had managed to make that differentiation apparent to people, and therefore there was a little bit of acceptance among the leadership that HR is a field that is distinct from personnel, right? But while it was apparent to the leadership, to the so to say to the peer group and the rank and file, it seemed to be a glorified personnel function, and therefore establishing what HR meant was itself a big challenge, right? And sometimes when you look back at it, you say, what were you doing? You're doing everything that personnel was. You are hiring people. You are kind of trying to make sure that their salaries are being paid on time and in a good fashion, etc., etc. But beyond that, what is it that you're doing that's different? Right? So it took some
Okay.
time for that, for the sense of HR to sink in the rank and file, like I said. Yeah.
Okay. But you kind of were okay with what the job involved on a day-to-day basis, which meant that you were interviewing a fair number of people, you were interacting with agencies to release ads. What were the kind of things that you were doing at that point?
I think I was very fortunate. The one part of the job that I did not do was actually working with, let's say, the
Okay.
factory part of HR. But everything else, like I said,
Okay.
setting up job descriptions, having to understand why this job was necessary,
Okay.
trying to create org structures, trying to figure out what kind of training programs to evolve. How do you look at, let's say, even in terms of wellness programs? Because TAFE at that time had started emphasizing a bit about
Okay.
employee wellness, which was again not something that you would typically associate with HR, but trying to get into that field. So it was pretty much everything, which, like I said, I think I was very lucky. Uh, Graduates these days are kind of forced to get into something that's much narrower, whatever it's called. I mean, there is talent acquisition, there is talent management, there is talent development, there is HR
Right.
op. So I was lucky that I had to do everything.
Okay.
So yeah,
Yeah. Today, people think that if I have to do everything, it's going beyond my job description, which is really what the
No,
learning happens when you go beyond it, right?
when you sign up for these kind of roles, I think the only job description is do what it takes, kind of
Right, right.
stuff. Yeah,
So
you
do you
will, you
remember
will.
some?
So,
Sorry, I interrupted there. Yeah.
no, I was saying you will occasionally sit back and take stock of what you have been able to do and where is all this headed. But otherwise, the broad definition is, yeah, you need to make this business work. You need to make this organization great. Do what it takes. Right? So yeah, that's
So in terms of, like you said, it was seen as the personal function, and then it expanded. You understood exactly what was happening because the efficiency of the company depended largely on the kind of people and how they work together as a team.
absolutely.
So, how did you begin to sort of make your way into understanding that? I know that you have diverse interests, Shantaram. That's one of the things that has you read a lot, you're involved with theater, you have bird watching, you're interested in the history of Chennai. There are so many things that facets about you which are not confined to one single aspect of what you do. So I'd just like you to expand on how did you go about acquiring this, or was it something that kind of seeped into you?
No, so there are a couple of let's say foundational premises. Venu. One is that while specialization is important and you need to be driving it for those kind of functions where it is absolutely essential, management is a specialization in itself which demands a very broad view and not just an in-depth view. Obviously there is a lot of depth to it, but it demands that you be broad enough to, to have a broad enough perspective to see how, as they say, a butterfly flapping its wings in Beijing is going to upset my market in New York 2 months from now,
Okay.
right? So the picking up of other interests, or rather, spending time on other interests, somehow always comes back to saying, how is this helping me in my organizational avatar, right? You mentioned bird watching. So bird watching is one where you have to observe very well, and that directly feeds into what you do. I don't know if you've read this book by Desmond Morris, a classic from the 70s called Manwatching,
Yeah.
right?
Man watching.
Which is like I said, it's a fundamental
Yeah.
foundation for folks who want to be working with people. I won't say folks who want to be in HR, but folks who want to work with people, for leaders, they need to be man watching or person watching, whichever you want to say, right? So that has informed the way my observational skills. Theater has been great because I think even before I got into it, there was this very superficial understanding about how roles in a theater production are crafted by the individual who's playing that role, right? And that's kind of comes directly back to organizations, okay, where
Very
you have
true.
the same person, it's the same JD, it's the same kind of background in terms of skills and capabilities, but the way in which that person gets the whole cast together to deliver, there is some secret sauce that happens, right? And again, nothing right, wrong about it. A production which has, let's say, John Gielgud starring as Hamlet would be as much of a success as somebody like P.C. Ramakrishna playing Hamlet, right? So that's
Right.
okay. Yeah. So
Right.
no harm there. So that understanding, I think, has led me to go back to theater. So kind of goes back and forth a bit, right?
That's a fascinating parallel because the moment you connected the word roles and then and man watching, it kind of
Mm.
changes the context altogether because then it's not saying bird watching and acting, but you're
Yeah,
saying, okay, I found the foundation, which is roles, and your interpretation of the role will vary depending on your understanding, your
absolutely.
ability to interpret it, and how you actually perform,
Right.
which I think is it's marvelous. So, give me a couple of instances that helped you understand that this is a place that you think you can change, or this is a place that you think you can do something or this is a career in which you can begin to define according to your terms?
I don't know. I mean, all that sounds to be very, very highfalutin, if I may say so. The the thing is, look, the fundamental premise of a business is to make sure that it delivers value for its stakeholders, right?
Right,
And when you start off, you are in a fairly small, role. So your stakeholders, your understanding of stakeholders is limited, and you try to do your best by them, right? But then, as you become more senior, the interplay of various roles, the interconnectedness of it all, that has been fascinating, right? And you know what they say, people are all the same. Persons may be different, but people are all the same, right? So it doesn't matter. You go into multiple industries, you see that the rhythm of how the workforce behaves has a very, very strong connection in terms of the way the leadership orchestrates it. And I'm using that word very deliberately because I mean the leadership is a conductor of the orchestra, not necessarily somebody who can play all the instruments as well as any of those individual musicians, right?
right,
So when you start thinking about it like that, you kind of get this thing of naturally being able to, push some of these leadership decisions, try to demystify them by getting it down to the front lines and preparing them, taking their input, going back, working on it. So that's been endlessly fascinating. Right? So every
give me a couple of instances where, let's say, an interaction where there was maybe a problem and then you kind of understood what the basis was, or an intervention, or is it being too specific? It could be.
I think, see, some of these things are very, you talk about small changes, the consistency, at least in a lot of people related developments. Um, there are these nuances that you pick up, which if you kind of adapt a little bit, the end result becomes very different, right?
Right.
I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but let me give you a story which I'm very fascinated by. A few years ago, we were working with a large infrastructure firm, and the idea was to kind of take their CXO minus one level leaders onto a development journey for themselves, right? So there were a bunch of people, and each one of them had different ways of expressing their strengths, right? And the idea was that it was not like we were bringing them anything new intellectually, but we were kind of trying to help them deploy what they knew into
Right.
how they do it at work, right? So there was this one vice president who was regarded as a terror, a short-tempered, a very difficult to please kind of person, right? So during the conversations that I had with him, his point was, look, if I don't put on this demanding persona, if I don't force them to do better, they will sink to a level of mediocrity, and therefore I have to be this way, right? But somewhere along the way, we said, that's fine, that's who you are, but why don't you consider, uh, appreciating people for small things? It doesn't have to be something big. You don't have to, wait till the end of a project to say that you've done a great job on the
Right.
project, right? And one of the goals that we set for him was that he had a span of about 14 people reporting to him. So we had told him that every week you should find at least not every week, every day you should find at least two things nice to say about any one of these 14 people on your team, and over the course of a week try to make sure that you cover all 14, right? um, Within 3 weeks he came back to say that, look, you know what, far from blunting my style, I think people are now responding. They're actually trying to do better even when I'm not pushing them, right? So so his recognition, while again, obviously he was a very high caliber manager, and intellectually he
Right.
knew the worth of praise and positive strokes. But to actually transform it into a repeatable behavior, that's where he was struggling, right? So he said it very simply, and then he just went ahead and did it, right? So when you talk about, what is the big change that happened, well, this is a small change, but the whole thing kind of ballooned in terms of the way his function was contributing to the organization, right? uh,
Okay.
so yeah, that's a very.
Amazing. No, I think that's a very, very pertinent, response. So you're watching the My First Job podcast. I'm speaking to R. Shantaram, who's one of the co-founders of Kelsa. And in the last segment, he spoke about how he started off in statistics because that is what he felt he could get into instead of, looking at just physics or maths or whatever it is. And then the move to XLRI and to HR, which was not planned in that sense of the word. And I think when he spoke about how in the 90s it used to be known as personnel, and then the understanding that human resources need to be more specialized and there's more understanding of how people interact within. I think he drew a wonderful parallel of the term roles when he applied it to his interests in theater and his interest in bird watching, where he sees bird behavior, but then man watching is really what HR does. So I think that's one of the fundamental premises. And he went on to narrate a wonderful incident where the change may have been small, but the effect was very, very large. So if you've liked what you listened to so far, share, like, and let people know. In the next segment, I'll be talking to him about what it means to be in HR and what is the career involved and what are the kind of traits that you need to have to excel in HR and understand it better. So, Shantaram, what are the things that, let's say, if you're looking at a company and you're looking to set up the HR department, so what are the kind of things that you would look for at that point and then say, okay, this is how
So
person
there are
needs to be?
so many people who tell me that they came into HR because they love working with people, and that's why they want to build a career in HR. I don't think that's a disqualification, but it is. I don't. It's definitely not a sufficient condition to be in HR, and I don't think it's a
Okay.
necessary condition either, right? Um, because I don't know. HR folks are supposed to be building systems, processes which enable other leaders to leverage their strengths with people. So if you're good at
Right.
working with people, uh, then I don't know, maybe sales, marketing, production, operations, customer relations, all those could be careers that you think of rather than HR. And something that you said at the beginning of this show, where you said people don't think of maths as being all that important. I believe, I don't have data, but a very strong sense that many people come in and choose HR because they think that they don't need math, right? But then it kind of defeats the whole purpose. If you have to work with the business, you've got to talk the language of business, and almost all of it is numbers, right?
Right.
So it makes it very difficult for people to connect with the business. Okay,
Right.
so what do you need fundamentally for HR? And I don't think there's any rocket science to it. You need the ability to be able to communicate, especially to be able to listen and ask questions. So, Venu, I'm sure you've heard of Professor Ashwat Damodaran, who teaches
Yeah.
valuation of companies, right? And one of the things that he pushes, and I think he kind of found the words to express my feelings, if I may say so, is that he talks about organization valuation as a function of numbers and narratives, right? So
Okay.
there is the hard numbers. How did you do? What's your ROCE? How do you make sure that you're earning unit economics, how do they work out? That's something that you've got to keep figuring out all the time. But you
Okay.
cannot ignore the stories behind the numbers. The people who, I mean, they sweated it out. There were tears. Uh, Maybe some would say that they also bled on the corporate battlefield. So all those stories that came out into how these numbers were achieved, I think both of them are important. While Professor Damodaran talks about using both of these as an indicator of how to value an organization, I think I would go further to say that the collective intelligence and the collective memory of the organization is only from the stories. The numbers are there; they are dull, they're printed black and white on
Right.
paper. The stories are what keep the organization together. What we talk about, the culture, how it is done here, right?
Right. Right.
That's what powers the organization ahead.
Okay. Now, in terms of, okay, since you're talking of numbers, today, what is the entry level salary in HR? What is the kind of progress that people make? Because that's one of the questions which I can't get away from it, because this is one of the first things that people are interested in. What is the starting salary? And, so this is something that I say, okay, I will go into it because I think it's something that people want to know. Is it like every other about 25?
No, so I only have to go back again decades ago to my
Yeah.
first class in statistics, where our HOD came in and said, "Look, I need to tell you something about statistics, and you know those
Okay.
things. There are three kinds of lies, damned lies, and statistics." And then he said, figures don't lie, but liars figure. Right. So when you ask me something like saying what is a starting salary for somebody in HR, I have a whole range starting from about 2.5 lakh a year to saying 27, 30 lakh a year as a median salary for somebody who passes out from one of the top tier B schools, Excel, IIMs, right?
Right.
So what do I quote as being the starting salary of HR, right? Because there are a whole lot of entry level jobs that need to get done. Now the skills to do that job are those jobs are very different. So you could end up being in a, let's say, in a small sub function of a total rewards program for the organization, and that sub function is just to make sure that you reconcile attendance every month and run payroll, right?
Right.
That doesn't pay much, right? But it's not that once you get in there, you're condemned to be there forever, right? It's from there. It's up to you to figure out what the connections are and how you can make sure that it goes ahead. Right? So, and to
Yeah.
me, I think that's where the fascination comes in, right? So early on, early '90s, nobody had Google Maps or internet or anything like that. But one of the things that I kind of kept thinking about myself when fixing interviews, especially for people who were, where it was being done outside Chennai, was to kind of figure out how easy is it for a person to come to the interview venue, right? And therefore try to look at it as a full experience of the individual. If I fix an interview at 3 in the afternoon, would that person be able to leave his place of work, come over, complete the interview, and go back somewhere? Or should I move this particular candidate because she is from a she has to go back a longer distance. So I'll schedule her at 2 o'clock because then she can finish the interview at 3 and get back home at a reasonable time, not when it is too dark, right? And you kind of, without having a go-to for data, you kind of had to go back to the old TTK maps, kind of look at it, make some assumptions about where this place is and all that, right? I don't know.
Wow.
Maybe, I had the luxury of time to do it then. Uh, but today it is far easier to be able to do it. Very few people seem to take that as part of their job, right? You have to schedule an interview, as an interview has to be scheduled. That's all. I don't care. I don't care about the
Yeah.
candidate
Yeah.
experience, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and that kind of comes back to kick you in the butt because the seeds of attrition are sown during the recruitment phase, right? And I have to say this about the numbers part of it, right? So we were working with this firm where um, they were facing a bit of attrition and they wanted to know what can be done to improve some of this. Okay, so the project was not necessarily about attrition, but about candidate experience during interviews. Okay. And luckily for us, they had a good security team, which was kind of taking down the time every candidate came in to meet. And so what we did was we took data for about 3-4 months, people who had come in, about 200 people who had come in for interviews over a 6-month span. We looked at how they behaved. And funnily, the first interview that people came for, on an average, they came about 5 to 7 minutes before the scheduled time of the interview, right? And on an average, they were met about 30 plus minutes after the scheduled time of the interview, right? And so then we whittle down to the candidates who were called for the next round. And we see that candidates who were called for the second round come about 5 minutes after the scheduled interview time and are met about 30 minutes after the scheduled interview time, right? So you can imagine how this affects the person who is coming in. Even before he or she has joined the organization, they have realized that this organization is not really finicky about time, which leads to a whole lot of things of saying that, okay, when my boss asks me to deliver at a certain date, on a certain date, I know I can get away with saying a date and not and giving it a couple of days later, right? So the let's say the indications of how the culture is could be seen from the way people behave during their interview schedule, right? Now this data played back to the managers, to the hiring managers, that said this is really what's happening here, right? And it took a little bit of let's say imagination and leap of faith for them to be convinced that this is why people are not as task focused and result focused as they want to be. Took a while for them to change their behavior, but they did. And sounds like a trivial measure to look at, but the speed at which the candidate was to be interviewed became a big thing. I think the organization has done very well because from being a fairly small organization, they have achieved global success today, right? And I'm talking about work that we did with them about 11 years ago, right? So it's taken some time, but they have stuck with it, right? So today,
Okay.
it is. I don't think they even remember the story of how it came about. But for them, making a candidate wait is not who we are, right?
Okay.
It's fascinating for me to see it evolve over all these years, right?
It's
So yeah,
when you
so about
started off, no, it's very important. I think when you started off by saying that you started consulting, you were looking at what was the journey to the organization. For most people, that is never I don't even think it's a consideration, especially when organizations are recruiting 10,000, 50,000 people at one particular place. They are rushed for time. They have 2 minutes with each person or 5 minutes or whatever it is. There's a series of interviews which is cascaded. You talking of ensuring that you were checking whether the girl can be scheduled earlier so that she can go back is such a wonderful way of showing empathy without, and the candidate will never know. She's not going to be told that it's not as if you're advertising the fact or you're telling, you've diagnosed that this is the average wait time, which for the client would have been, look, it's the guy who needs the job. It's not, or the person who needs the job. And you flip the entire thing by saying it can lead to attrition, because sometimes in attrition they look for culture and have I done this? And you're saying something, how something as simple as this
so people
can
people
have such
mimic,
a long
right? people
lasting.
people mimic. It is that's the way I learn about the organization. I see what's happening and I make my choices based on that, right? And for us to fall into pattern, we are human beings and we kind of use that to make our decisions. So yeah, I came in 5 minutes early, these guys called me 30 minutes late, it's okay, I can go late second time around, right? So whatever, say what you will. I mean, they need the job, but now because you're calling me for a second time, you need me more than I need you. So I will put my price up. I can create any one of those narratives, but to actually figure out which one is true or not I don't think it's worth the candle. But let me also say this: I think it takes a whole lot of let's say self-awareness and a whole lot of humility for a hiring manager to say yes. I think it's worth giving this a shot. right? Of, okay, I will now
Okay.
commit to making sure that if I am scheduled for an interview, this takes precedence over everything else, right? And that was the big
Okay.
behavior change that happened. When it happens across the organization, so now you kind of move to a new way of doing things, right? So yeah.
And then
Now,
that becomes the
this
culture.
correct, and it was easy because I mean, it's always easy when the topmost leader telegraphs very clearly saying, "This is what I expect." Right? So I expect no candidate should wait for the interview, right? And then flow it on
Okay.
to say that yeah, we need to be more, on meetings on time, etc., etc. So, so going on, they had actually created something which is fairly unique. I don't think I've seen it in any other organization, which is a meeting effectiveness index, which said that yeah, we spend so much time in
Okay.
meetings, we're actually doing it well. So meeting effectiveness index is a composite which is made up of the time at which the meeting started, the time at which it ended, the number of agenda items that were covered, the number of non-agenda items that were covered, the people who were present, absent, etc., etc. So that when you start doing that, obviously nothing is going to happen for the first 2, 3, 4, 5 meetings, maybe not even for the 50th meeting. But over a 6 month period, you start looking at those numbers and you start feeling a little abashed to say that, look, I mean, this is us, right? So that leads to a whole lot of different way of doing things. Yeah. So now I've make sure, if I'm calling a meeting, now I'm expected to set an agenda. Otherwise, people will not turn up because meeting effectiveness index goes for a 6, right? So things like that, which are very trivial, if I may say so, but have fairly large consequences.
Okay. Wonderful, Shantaram. I think these were so valuable. Okay. You're listening to My First Job. I'm speaking to Shantaram. And I think he brought about two small but very pertinent incidents about how change was managed at the companies. And it started out with having the understanding that you treat your future employees with the same concern and consideration that you would accord to your current employees. And that is such an important aspect. The last thing which he spoke about was the meeting index, the meeting effectiveness index, which seems small on the face of it. But these are the things, these are the details that people tend to miss out on, especially when the organization grows larger. If you like what you've heard so far, share, like, and tell more people about it, because this is what we want should reach a whole lot of people and help them understand what their careers should be or can be. So, in the final segment, I'm going to speak to Shantaram about organizational development and how he sees it. So, we took some time to get here, but I think whatever ground you've traversed so far applies across organizations, big, small. It applies across a whole set of employees and employers. So, how do
Absolutely.
you go about diagnosing and how do you help to develop organizations?
Okay. No, so I wish I could kind of boil it down to a blood test kind of thing, but there are obviously very uh, so this is where I think you've got to go back to the theoretical frameworks, right? There is an enormous amount of research that's been done on organizational growth and maturity, right? Because I mean, what's development? That there is a certain maturity that you kind of acquire over a period of time, right? So
Yeah.
there are multiple models that look at it. I think the strongest of them kind of looks at the age of an organization and the size of the organization versus the way in which certain processes are set, right? So there are flashpoints for every organization. You start off, the founders pretty much do everything. The lines are very clear. Every decision, they are the ones who take it. They kind of make sure that it happens. But then when the organization reaches a certain size after a period of time, then there's a little bit of disquiet. uh, you need to have something, you need to have a little more autonomy for the next round of people who have come in, right? So now the challenge around being able to define roles, being able to say that, okay, where do I step back and where does somebody else step in? Right? How do I let go of some things? All those become important. So to be able to craft a let's say a development desire of saying that, okay, I am. So we worked with a fintech firm, right? And we started engaging with them when they were 5 co-founders strong. They are today well over 2,000 people. But the clarity of the 5 co-founders, not all of them at the same level in terms of peers. There were obviously some were
Right.
more senior than the others, right? But the amount of time that they spent in being able to articulate what the future organization should look like was so powerful that it served as a template for us to say, okay, if you want your organization to be this way, these are the systems that you need to put in. Okay, it's a completely different matter that the organization has grown far beyond what they had, started off with. Okay, but
Okay.
those 5 people, the recognition that it is important to step back and have this kind of a conversation rather than just go helter skelter looking for business all the time. I think that was a big plus. So for them to be able to have those conversations, to refresh them, to kind of communicate to the next line, as the organization grew bigger, I don't think any of them has forgotten that ethos, and the newcomers also have been able to feel it, right? So when you talk about growth, maturity, there are certain interventions that literature tells us we need to be looking at, but the quality of these interventions really depends upon how the leadership uh, adapts to them, right? Now I can. So there are job descriptions that get written, but in a dynamic environment, the job description is out of date by the time the next monthly review comes up.
Right.
Uh, so the recognition that, look, we've got to keep engaging with people to kind of say that, okay, what are my expectations of not just what you do, but how you do it and how you pass it on to the next person, how you create a team around. Those are ongoing conversations, and I think if you randomly put a number to it, I think the top leader should be looking at these issues maybe about 1/3 of the time, right?
Okay.
Look at what are these people processes that are so necessary for my organization. And I will dare say that finance is not something that they really need to spend their time on, because those numbers are very clear. They're there. End of the day, you know whether the money is in the bank or not, right? So your accounting guy will do the accounting mumbo jumbo necessary to make sure that the figures are reflected, right? But 1/3 of the time with the people and looking at people processes, 1/3 of the time looking at customers and what customers need, and maybe 1/3 of the time looking at what the future holds. I believe that's how the top leaders should kind of slice their time. Okay,
Time.
that's an enormous amount of time. And once they start doing it, it is fairly clear that to the rest of the organization that this is important. I mean, if you go back and look at GE in its heyday, the late I mean, 80s through the late 90s, right? Jack Welch, whatever his other faults were, was absolutely. I mean, he was endlessly rigorous about people processes, right? And that got the scale that GE was famous for at that time, right? He would just say, well, people say that he had this thing of fire the bottom 5%, but what they forget is that it was very difficult for somebody to get to bottom 5% 2 or 3 quarters in a row. GE spent an
Right.
enormous amount of time making sure that people were not left behind so easily, right? So it was, and I think so this superficial understanding of some of these things, this thing of saying stack rank them, fire the bottom 5%, without realizing that there was a lot of organizational commitment to make sure that you don't remain at the bottom 5%,
Mm.
right? Similarly, when you say that the IT story for India, I'm in a sense sick of hearing it quoted even today, saying that you promote them before they are ready, right?
Okay.
Uh, as with a lot of things in the Indian IT industry. I think it was Infosys who made that statement at least publicly famous, that you promote them before they're ready and then train them for it. Everybody takes that first part of it. Everybody forgets that Infosys has invested so much into that second part, right? The kind of facilities that Infosys built for training its people, not just in tech but also in management. Nobody wants to replicate that. They just want to take that first part of it because it's the easy one. I make a decision, I promote somebody, it involves
Or
somebody.
they prefer to hear that and not the rest of it because that involves a lot of purpose. But
Yes.
this is something I've been wanting to ask you, which is, have you seen that large organizations are more distant from their employees, or do you think those bonds as an organization grows selectively weaker, or is it that those processes that have to be followed necessitates a certain kind of behavior within?
So I will go back to what I spoke about. As an organization grows, it goes through these crises, right? So let's say, I mean, and I did mention that one of the earliest crises that organizations would go through is what is the crisis of leadership? Who is it that
Right.
who has to make certain decisions, right? So that is something that would happen, right? And then over a period of time, then there is a crisis of saying, okay, we don't know. There's a crisis of standardization that happens, right? So that leader is making decisions in a certain other way. This leader is making it in a certain other way. So what should I standardize? What should I bring together? And then it becomes, if not done right, that can lead to too much of bureaucracy and over centralization. And then you have a
Right.
crisis of literally centralization, right? The rigidity. Okay. So you have to kind of, and that's why I said 1/3 of the time you've got to keep looking at this and say, what am I doing? What am I doing right? What do I need to do differently in
Right.
order to make sure that I don't ossify on some of these areas, right? Again, but the fascinating thing about this, Venu, is that there is no right answer. You had somebody in the 90s, Percy Banovic, who was then heading ABP, had this mandate which said that once a business unit starts coming to about 180 to 200 people, we should start thinking about splitting that unit. Right? That was his number. Okay, and you kind of combine it with the famous thing of the Dunbar number, right? Which is
Done.
150,
Yeah. Right.
right? So, is that the ideal size of an organization? Right? And you kind of bring to it with the concept of what people talk about as holacracies, which are like interconnected orbits of teams. Okay, so as long as there is some thought going around how these teams interact with each other and what is it that we want them to do in order to deliver what the business needs, right? I'm sure you will find the right answers. If there was one right answer, right, then it'll be too
Everybody
easy.
would try and follow that.
There's no fun in the game,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Let me come at this from a different angle, which is, do you think that it's necessary to ensure that the communication channels are in place between organizations that multiply across geographies? It could be across cities, it could be across countries. How do you ensure that communication systems and cultures get replicated or remain streamlined?
No, you are absolutely right. To me, there are two things, especially when there is a phase of rapid growth. There are two things that are essential for the organization to become to become and remain strong. One is communication. The other is credibility, right?
Okay.
So if I am communicating something which is like a lot of hot air, right, then I lose credibility. So no matter that I'm growing rapidly, etc., etc., but my gas is growing much faster than my actual growth, people will see through that, right? And then you create a system where everybody is gassing all the time. Okay, so that credibility communication needs to keep going together. You don't want you, you expect your leaders to be optimistic. You don't want them to be mournful. So every organization will have setbacks, especially if it's a startup. But for the leader to demonstrate a positivity in the setback and to say that, okay, this is what we've learned from it, and this is how we will do things differently next time around. Keeps it to himself or herself, there is not much that the organization learns. But to push and say that, okay, how are we going to do this better next time around, creates a culture where people say that, okay, fine, we are not going to be unjustifiably criticized for not delivering on something, for having a failure, right? But we
Okay.
will do it and we will come out stronger out of it. Easier said than done. Yeah. Uh, but it
So
takes a
is
very
the
strong leader to do that.
so is the organization largely shaped by the person who's running it at that particular point in time, or do you think that there's some kind of a gene, or there is some DNA which people speak of, but I really don't know what that thing is about?
So again, I mean, because some of these things play out over a long period of time, I will have to kind of look at it that way. Uh, GE was very successful, right? Uh, Mr. Welch stepped down, Jeffrey Immel took over. The organization went in a different direction, right? Looking back today after 20 years, saying whether GE was successful, has been successful, it is still a very respected firm. It still does
Right.
very well in its markets, but it doesn't have the aura that it had 20
It
years ago,
used to
30
have.
years ago, right? So that's one example of how, in my mind, how leaders impact the organization. But the counter to that is, and I will take the case of very specifically, very narrowly of Hindustan Unilever, right? So there's something I read a couple of years ago which said that over the last 20 years, Hindustan Unilever has contributed over 400 CEOs to India Incorporated, right? Now, the power of an organization which losing almost like every second week they lose a CEO level person and still does not falter in its growth and the way they kind of command the markets, right? Now that speaks volumes for the nature of leadership that they have nurtured with it, right? So there is a lot of commonality in the leadership. There is continuity. It can afford to lose 20 people of very high caliber every year and have maybe 30 others stepping up to replace them, right? So
Okay.
it's fascinating. So the very easy answer to your question, Renu, is that yes, certainly leaders do leave a mark, but can a leader leave a mark which says that no leader will leave a mark? But every leader is taken up. Now that's a very very difficult one to achieve over generations.
Wonderful, Shantaram. I really, there is so much more that I want to speak to you about, and maybe at some point we will get back to that. But in closing, how do you look back on what you have done? Is there something else that you would, when you look at your own career and what you have gone about, is there a point at which you look at analyzing it, or do you look at this as, yeah, this is how careers are? I mean,
Oh,
I want that answer because I've not asked this question to anyone.
So I don't know. I have never been one to plan things too rigidly. So there was a vague this thing saying that by the time I have about 7 8 years experience, I should be looking at heading the function. Uh, that happened maybe, I don't know, 12 years later when I got my first chance to head the function. So that way my was too late. But then looking back and thinking about it, that's counterfactual. I don't. I mean, I can't do anything about it. It's done. It's done. What could I have done better? Yeah, there are things that you learn which are applied at a certain moment, right? Uh, but okay. I'll come back to this. So we were talking about incentives in organizations, and especially for
Right.
sales, right? So the challenge is that if your incentive program becomes too predictable, then it is not delivering on its purpose, right? Now this kind of runs counter to what most HR people think in terms of saying that people need to know what they are going to get, right? Absolutely, but the specifics of how I will run the incentive is something that I use as a managerial tool. I would like my sales managers to be able to say, okay, I will keep it fair, but this month the parameters are going to be A and B. The next month, I need parameters F and right? So it leaves the salespersons also guessing about what are the new things that they're going to do, while being convinced about the fairness of the system. And as a HR
Absolutely.
person, the only thing that
Right.
you need to do is what you said: communicate in advance, right? You can't
Right.
go back and say end of the month, say, actually what I wanted to measure was this, so therefore I'm not giving you incentive. You're doomed, right? But use the tool the way it is meant to be used, right? Go ahead
Yeah.
and say that this is what I want. Set those targets, and then make sure the system is fair. So once you have a fair framework, the managers know how to kind of, uh, put different parameters in place. Then it's fun, because
Yeah.
every salesperson will now be trying to, and they will try to game the system. You do this,
Right.
they'll start thinking about, okay, next month what are the parameters that they're going to get? How can I? And that lifts the collective ability of those salespeople to look at all those things that a salesman is supposed to be taking care of, right?
Right.
Um, so unfortunately, our incentive system, our way of using those incentive systems are more like saying, okay, I want to guarantee that you get so much. Doesn't work.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shantaram. I wish that there were several things from our conversation that we could have gone more deeply into. But
As
thank you for
always.
coming on the show. This is a tastemaker. This is something that people will look at and then say, ha, oh, this is what it involves. And you haven't given any of those standard textbook definitions. You've given it with, uh, you know, wonderful examples. And thank you so much for coming on the show. And
Really, really appreciate you having me over, Venu. This was delightful. I was kind of wondering what I'm going to do here, but thank you for relive some moments.
great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, folks. Bye.
Yeah.